Well, it's still morning, so good morning, Pilgrim United Church of Christ, and good morning to our Anti-Racism Book Club members. Good morning to our Facebook audience, and good morning to our Zoom congregation. We're very thrilled to bring to you this live forum via Zoom with Dr. Obery Hendricks, who's the author of Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Ruining Our Faith and Our Nation. Just a little bit about Dr. Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks was a former Wall Street investment executive and past president of Payne Theological Seminary, the oldest African-American theological seminary in the United States. He is currently a visiting scholar at Columbia University in the Department of Religion and the Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies, a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, and emeritus professor of biblical interpretation at New York Theological Seminary. He is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Dr. Hendricks holds the Master of Divinity degree with academic honors from Princeton Theological Seminary, and both the MA and PhD in Religions of Late Antiquity from Princeton University. I first met Dr. Hendricks when I was on sabbatical at Union Theological Seminary back in 2011. And we've maintained a distant but frequent communication ever since, and I was thrilled to see him at the annual Samuel DeWitt Proctor Minister and Lay Leadership Conference recently in Atlanta. So we are here, and do we have Dr. Hendricks back on the video?
Yes, we do.
If we can, yes.
I'm here.
Dr. Hendricks, I'm thrilled to have you today. We just want to give you a little brief of who we are and what we've been doing. Pilgrim has been engaged in an anti-racism book club for about 3 years now. Ever since the murder of George Floyd, we've been studying this question of anti-racism. And we read a series of books and are very glad to have most recently read your book on Christians Against Christianity. We had 2 sessions, a Thursday and a Tuesday session, that had about 15 members each. So 30 of our congregation and community were part of the Anti-Racism Book Club. However, a number of other members of our congregation and the community have read your book. And so I'd just like to give you an opportunity to speak to us for a few minutes about the impact of your book and the feedback that you've received, and any other comments that you'd like to make as we prepare our conversation with you today. So tell us, how has been the reception of your book here in the United States?
Well, thank you. So good to see you again, brother, and thank you so much for this invitation to share with the people. You know, the impact of Christians Against Christianity has been, what I've gotten personally has been mostly very positive. It has seems to have had an impact in a number of circles. I've been thanked by a number of folk, Black and white, for bringing these issues to their attention. The attacks and criticisms I've gotten have not been, I'm not seeing any substantive ones at all. In other words, ones that really take issue with the issues I raise, and no substantive responses. I mean, they might say, I don't like it, I don't agree, but I have not seen any contradictions yet of anything that I've that I've written. You know, the Trump people are, well, you know, you got him wrong. Well, you know, contradict me. I mean, if I had some money to throw around, I'd say, look, here's $5,000. Show substantively where anything I've raised is wrong. I'm not going to do that. But I think I still have that same $5,000 in my pocket a year from now. So essentially, the impact has been a strong impact, and I've spoken all over the country because of this book, and in a number of I'm in several white Christian nationalism groups, challenging white Christian nationalism. One of the main ones is sponsored by PRRI, in Washington D.C., on whose board I sit, and so I'm satisfied with the response that it's gotten.
Thank you. So I want to ask you to bring us up to date, particularly on your writings around reproductive justice. Now, I don't know if your book had been published. I don't think it had been published or even written when Dobbs was decided. And so give us some additional reflection on where our nation is and where our faith stands in terms of the question of reproductive justice, and how the reversal of Roe v. Wade, the assault on reproductive rights, the laws that are banning abortion across the country. Please give us some reflections on that for a moment.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm a biblical scholar. And so the approach I've taken is to look at some of these issues, the issues on which right-wing evangelicals base their appeal to dominate the United States. And I engaged abortion on biblical grounds as well. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that abortion is a sin. In fact, it's not really engaged at all. The only place we have a voluntary abortion is in Numbers 5, which says that God will abort the fetus of a married woman if it's found that if she is pregnant by someone other than her husband. But other than that, and I do go beyond the Bible. I look at the history of the way that abortion has been treated since the dawn of Christendom, and there's never been any consensus on when life begins. If there's the predominant belief in Christendom through the ages was that a fetus should be considered a child or viable when there's a quickening, when a woman can feel a child moving in her womb. Prior to that, a fetus was not considered to be a person, and so that would mean that abortion is not murder. And so I go along those lines, and a number of very important Christian theologians adhered to that line, that a fetus was not viable, was not a person until there was a quickening. So this whole thing about conception, life begins at conception when it's just a zygote, is not biblical. And then we have some verses that say that when I was in the womb, God knew me, and those. Well, that speaks to God's foreknowledge. That's no biological commentary there at all. Last thing that's so clear is that in Leviticus, Exodus, when it talks about if a pregnant woman is injured when two men are fighting, and her fetus is injured or harmed or killed, that the penalty for harming the woman is an eye for an eye. The penalty for harming the fetus is a financial fine. So by all biblical lights, and for much of and maybe most of the history of Christendom, abortion is not seen as murder. And so these abortion laws are based, and they're pushed by conservative Christians. This whole notion that abortion is murder is not biblical. Their whole foundation is wrong. And so that's how I have attacked. And so what I mean, I've engaged it. And so what that means then is that Roe v. Wade, if you want to look at it in biblical terms, it should be allowed to stand. And but and let me say one more thing here. The reason why abortion is a major issue now is not that it's been a major issue throughout Christendom forever. It was an issue in the Catholics, of course, but it wasn't until the 80s that Protestants got serious about abortion. Why? Because right-wing evangelicals, Paul Weyrich and a number of big shot right-wing evangelicals got together because they realized that they could not they could not mobilize people to follow them with anti-communist propaganda because the Red Scare was over. They didn't want to be seen as their appeals to racism weren't working as well. So they came together to decide what wedge issues can we come up with that we can whip people all up and get them to follow us in our quest to take over this nation. What issues can we come up with? And Randall Balmer documents this, who happened to have been in that meeting about 1980. He said they decided on two wedge issues that they would push to try to whip up the population so they could take over the country. And those were homosexuality and abortion. And it's at that point, the early 80s, that they started pushing these issues when they came to prominence. Later in the 80s and up until this moment. So the whole thing, in a nutshell, is fallacious in biblical and Christian terms, and they're lying about it. But they've made abortion a litmus test of whether you're an authentic Christian or not, and that's just bull. That's just anti-biblical.
Well, I find that part of your book so fascinating that you document that their motive for using this issue was not theological. Their motive was not biblical. Their motive was strictly political.
Exactly.
Without any regard to the impact on women and on society at large. And now we find ourselves in total chaos regarding this issue. Another thing that you address in your book that people are fascinated with, how do you explain, and I'm asking you to repeat some of this because our Zoom audience and our Facebook audience, not everyone has read the book, but how do you explain the unflinching devotion of right-wing evangelicalism to Donald Trump? How do you account for that? Yeah.
Well, first, right-wing evangelicalism is essentially ideological. It's meaning that they understand the Bible and promulgate their understanding of the Bible refracted through the prism of their own interests and desires. In other words, their interests are more important to them than biblical foundation. And Trump essentially came out saying that he hated the same folks that they hated. He was willing to be as uncivil as they were willing to be, and folk supported him because Donald Trump, who was as irreligious as you can get, that he pandered to the right wing, and then some of their leaders got together and started lifting up this indecent, pathologically lying, sociopathic piece of trash, and lifting him up as a messianic figure. Why? Because he served their agenda. It had nothing to do with anything that Donald Trump had ever done that was decent, because he's really never done any decent thing at all, unless it by default served him. It just happened to be decent. When you look in his history, there's nothing about this character that is decent at all. But he served their interests, and their interests of keeping brown people out of the country. He served they saw him as being willing to serve their interests, to let them dominate society with their twisted libertarian ethics. And so that's why they support this character. And in the book, you know, I mean, I even have a couple of pages to show just how backward he is. I mean, how someone asked him to explain who Jesus was to him. It sounded like he was describing a comic book hero. He you know, when he mentioned, when they asked him about what Easter meant to him, I mean, he's nothing about the resurrection, nothing about God, nothing at all. It's just a bunch of foolishness, and people are falling for it, because these leaders are many of these white folks don't know any better. Black folks either, the few who follow them, they don't know any better. They would not believe that their leaders would lie to them and mislead them. So they're wrong, but many of them are sincerely wrong. They don't know any better, but their leaders darn sure know better. Because and last thing to say is that right-wing evangelicalism is itself an anti-Christian movement. It's not just unchristian, it's anti-Christian, like Trump is anti-Christian in that they militate against the basics of the Bible, of the gospel. Jesus says the greatest social commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, to want the same goods and freedoms and security and health and good health for your neighbor as you want for yourself. Well, these people, their movement is not based on loving neighbor. It's not based on caring for the least of these. It's just the opposite. They seek to dominate America's society in the name of Christianity, but through their unchristian strategy. So it's sick. And what's so frightening though is we have tens of millions of people fooled by it, and they have an outside influence, a policy influence, and they are destroying this nation in the name of Jesus Christ. That's what they're doing. And the travesty is that most churches are not standing up and saying a darn word about it. We're not seeing Christendom, and particularly, you think Black denominations would stand up and oppose this stuff. They have nothing to say. 4 years of a sick demonic presence in the White House, and none of the Black denominations have stood up and said anything of any particular substance. And we're not seeing many churches at all doing anything to fight this evil onslaught.
I want to go back to the meeting that the evangelicals had. You said there were two issues that they decided were going to be their wedge issues. Abortion was one. The second was the LGBTQ issue. And for the longest time, they were so just maniacal in their assault on our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender siblings. And now they're attacking trans children. It just seems that there is no limit to the lengths they'll go to keep their political advantage. And so I want you to reflect a bit about how Christian their assault is, and also what should the liberal progressive church be doing to push back, to assert our solidarity with the LGBTQ community.
And what was the first part of your question? I have the last part.
I was just saying that they have gone from a kind of generalized assault on the LGBTQ community to focusing on an assault on trans children.
Yeah, it's all part of their strategy. I mean, it's now that Roe versus Wade was repealed, and so that they don't they're not getting as much traction from that, because in a sense they've sort of won that battle. They need something else in their strategy to work people up. And so this whole assault on transgender children and misportrayal of what transgenderism is about is just the latest in their strategy to try to maintain the narrative and to demonize everything that's different from them. Again, if a faith that's supposed to be based on loving your neighbor as yourself, but instead tends and decides to attack children and demonize children, and in some cases even destroy children, knowing that transgender children have a hard enough time as it is, and with the public onslaught and the government coming down on them. These children, they've always committed suicide, unfortunately, and now we're probably going to see, as the statistics come out, we'll probably see an uptick in transgender children suicide. So that is an evil thing, because it's picking on innocent people because you can, to serve your own agenda, and that is the height of evil. And what can we do? Well, we need to be in dialogue. Our church to be in dialogue, like we're in dialogue now. But churches have to remember that focus on what the core of the gospel is. Of course, it is love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is the Jesus says it's a commandment. It is a commandment to not only want the same goods in life, the same healthiness, the same freedom to live and to be for others as we want for ourselves, but it also implies, because we will struggle to have those things for ourselves, then it implies that we have the responsibility to struggle for others in society to have the same freedom and so forth. So what does that mean? That churches have a responsibility to struggle against this onslaught. And remember, Matthew 25:31 through 46, and I talk about it, throughout the book. That's the only real standard of judgment, divine judgment, that Jesus gives us, and that is, as you have loved it, as you haven't done it for the least of these, you have not done it for me. And it essentially says those. The beginning of the parable says that those who try to feed somebody, to help somebody, in other words, to do justice in society, that they will go to heaven. But those who do not look out for the least of these, the parable says, they will go to hell. Well, we need to focus on that, because this standard that Jesus gives us for judgment is not about what we believe. It's not about who we hate. It's not about who you sleep with. It's not about whether you're rich or poor. It says we will be judged by whether we're trying to help people. So it has nothing. So getting into people's sexuality really doesn't have any place in the gospel, as long as they're trying to live decent lives and treat somebody right. So I'm saying all that to say we need to lift this up in the church, and we need to stand up, and churches have to start mobilizing, have to start protesting. They can go to Usher's annuals in the afternoon, and they can go to State House or the White House to complain. And these are the kinds of things we have to do. But not only that, we have to push our people to read and to be informed, and to speak to our ministerial colleagues, many of whom will barely read newspapers, that they must get up off their rusty dusty and fight this evil onslaught, because these people are trying to destroy so many of us, and they're destroying the fabric of this nation in the bargain.
Yeah. So I want to give some instructions to our audience. We have some folk, about 30 folk gathered here in person. If you would like to ask a question of Dr. Hendricks, we will provide you with a handheld microphone. Where is it? Oh, I need someone to Ken, could you offer the microphone to anyone who has a question? And if you are on Zoom or on Facebook, you can enter your question in the Q&A feature of the Zoom meeting. So while you compose your questions, I'm going to ask Dr. Hendricks one more question. Now, you very eloquently redefine or actually undermine the definition, or let me put it this way. You very effectively retell the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, so that it's eminently clear that Sodom and Gomorrah, and usually we talk about Sodom, was not at all about homosexuality, that the subsequent references in the Bible to the story of Sodom never mention any kind of sexual relations at all, actually, but just this general concept of inhospitality. And so if you are correct, and I believe that you are, then are you suggesting that the true Sodomites are the people who do not treat people kindly, who do not welcome the stranger, who do not live the Christian life as we're taught? And so maybe there should be an appeal to the dictionaries of the world, the Oxford English, to change their definition of sodomy. Because if you look in the dictionary right now, sodomy is defined as same gender sexual relations.
All right, brother. I'm on my
no linguistic foundation.
All right, I quit. This is too dangerous. You're going to dangerous territory. You're gonna tell people if you're inhospitable to immigrants, for instance, you're a sodomite. Well, I want to say something. I mean, you make a good point, but I'm not redefining. What I'm just explaining story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Actually, it has nothing to do. It says nothing. I mean, what you have is some men who want to gang rape another man. It doesn't say anything about homosexuality. In fact, people in antiquity had no sense of homosexuality as an identity. And you're right. Ezekiel, for instance, others explicitly say that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was inhospitality. Inhospitality could be a death sentence in those days. People come out of the desert hungry and thirsty, and you don't look out for them. That could be very serious. So inhospitality is a very serious charge, and the way that you have explained inhospitality in the modern moment, is very important. So the real sodomites are those who not only turn a blind eye to the suffering of the people, but who cause the suffering and alienation and oppression of the people. But I don't know that I'm going that far yet in the public sphere.
Well, I thought one of the.
I think it's very important. I think you're right, brother. But I'm not that brave yet.
Brought forward that it still helped me learn something new, because of the cultural hegemony of right-wing biblical interpretation. We have all kind of succumbed to their definitions, and even their telling of this story conjures up an entire city of gay men. And what you point out is that this was an act of violence. As you just mentioned, these men, what proportion of the city they were, we have no idea whether they were 10 people out of 1,000 or 1,000 out of 1,000, but that they decided that these people were vulnerable. They were friendless because they didn't care about Lot. He didn't have any political power, and that they saw an opportunity to exploit them. And so that's what they did. But what you also added to that is, why do we presuppose that these men did not leave that attempted gang rape and return to their heteronormative lives?
Yeah. Well, see,
You've
that's
converted all of these men in their sexuality when that really isn't the point at all. And what it really says is that the heteronormative men are quite capable of acts of violence, acts of sexual violence. And that's something that I don't think has been lifted up about this story. And I think that's an important dimension to this, that why would we want to convert them into something that they're not? And to recognize that heterosexual men are quite capable of sexual violence.
but that's, I mean, that's well known, of course. I think, I mean, your point is an important one, but what's also left out is that Lot offered his daughters to be gang raped, and they don't talk about that. And if there is any real, you know, if there's if real sexuality and patriarchy to be condemned, it's on. It has to do with Lot, who so devalues his daughters that he's willing to allow them to be gang raped. That's left out of it. And so, I mean, you're absolutely right. And what is really left out of it is that they were, and those men were guilty of trying to engage in radical injustice. And that goes against the biblical norm, of the foundational biblical norm of mishpat, justice. And so you're right, it's a very rich story, but it just continues to be held up in propagandistic ways to demonize same gender loving people, when Jesus didn't say who you should love. He just said, just make sure you do love.
Amen.
And treat people right, you know.
I won't press whether or not we should start calling different people sodomites for being inhospitable, but I am not giving up on appealing to the dictionaries. Seriously, to appeal to the dictionaries to correct their definition, and to the courts. I mean, our laws still use that word wherever it is legislated. And while many of those laws have been rendered unenforceable, the Supreme Court in Lawrence ruled that, you know, they could not be punished. But this new movement that has overturned Roe v. Wade, they're going after the Lawrence decision. They want again to criminalize same-gender loving relations. And so even the laws on our books still use this word incorrectly. So I think that's a campaign that's worthy of our energy and efforts. Do we have any questions from our congregation gathered, or any questions online? Let's see if we have any questions here. I did. Oh, okay. Okay, here's a question from Lynn, Dr. Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks, here in Southern California, we have an absence of Black churches and leaders, which I believe has grown out of a larger than admitted white Christian evangelical population. Do you have any suggestions for growing spirituality among Black and other people of color living here in the West?
We have an absence of Black church leaders, which I believe is growing.
We're kind of sparse here in Southern California. Yeah,
just a minute. I'm rereading this question, which I believe is growing out of a larger than admitted white movement. Do you have any? An absence of Black churches and leaders, I believe, is growing out of a larger, growing spiritual about Black. I'm trying to understand what that question is asking. Could that be paraphrased? It's not really.
The way I would interpret it would be that, you know, the strength of the Black church tends to be in the South, where you have large numbers. But here in Southern California, state of California itself is only 8% Black. And so I guess I would paraphrase the question as saying, given our smaller numbers, what strategies can the Black churches in Southern California and California, or the West generally, where Black churches are sparse, what strategies can be employed to have a greater impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, you know, I think it comes down again. My personal view is this: that Black churches have to become clear on what the gospel is about, what the gospel says, what the core of the gospel is, in order to be able to draw on its own full strength. It means an educated congregation. It means an educated pulpit, because there aren't a lot of seminaries in the West, and so we don't have a large population of seminary trained clergy. And I think what it comes down to, we must strengthen ourselves by knowing what the gospel is, and then from there going out and raising the question elsewhere. Engaging other churches, leaders, religious leaders and pastors should be coming together, in my estimation, for not just for conferences, for preaching and all of that stuff all the time, and much of which turns out to be a competition to see who can be more like James Brown than James Brown often. And I stand by that, by the way. But come together to talk, to share information, to talk about what is justice making, what are the issues that we're confronted with, what is racial capitalism, what does capitalism have to do with our people, and what does the gospel tell us to do? Also, what we don't have really in many churches at all is a real vision of the kind of world we want. We hear this thing about without vision of people perish. Well, what's the vision we have? What kind of political economy do we want? We know that capitalism is going to pass away like mercantilism and feudalism did, because folk made those systems, and folks made capitalism too. We'll move to something else. Well, what do we want to move toward? Right? What kind of policies do we want? What kind of justice? Do we believe in libertarian justice, meaning that it's all about people having freedom to do what they want, rather than recognizing that the gospel is about responsibility to each other? These are the kinds of things we want to do. But it comes down again that we need to know what the heck we really are about, and what we're commanded to do before we can call others and mobilize others. And so I'm all about folk coming together. And see, I grew up in the Black nationalist movement, and one thing we did was study, and got together and tried to come up with visions all of the time. And Jews have a tradition of study, Muslims have a tradition of study, Christians not so much at all, right? And so, we must know who we are and what we're about, and try to be clear on the kind of world we want to work toward, and then move out from there. I think for me, that's the foundational thing.
Amen. Well, my last question to you is this. You write extensively in your book about the unholy alliance between right-wing evangelicals and the NRA. This year is breaking all records for gun violence. We have seen neighbors turn on neighbors. We've seen everyday common events, knocking on the wrong door, pulling into the wrong driveway to turn around, asking a neighbor to be quiet so that an infant can sleep. And all of these everyday activities are turning deadly because of the violence and the proliferation of guns and gun violence in our culture. in closing, I'd like you to speak about the state of our nation in regards to gun violence and what the gospel ought to mean for our struggle to end gun violence in America.
Yeah, wow, wow. Yeah, the NRA, I'm hoping to publish an article on this shortly. The NRA is really, and the right-wing Christians are really behind this gun proliferation. The NRA was a pretty benign organization till about the late 70s or the early 80s, I believe, when they had a takeover by right-wing evangelicals of the NRA. And that's when you started. Never before do we see anything about a God-given right for, to own guns. The NRA, was about gun safety and gun knowledge. But since that time, NRA has conflated gun ownership with Christianity. And to say something that's blasphemous is that it is a God-given right to own an AK-47 is just sick. I mean, a weapon that was designed to kill human beings. You don't hunt with an AK-47 because you end up destroying the your animal prey, the carcass. This is for killing human beings. And so but the NRA conflated it, and that all became obscured under this whole notion of we have a God-given right. And so then the NRA they started a prayer breakfast. They have also they've lied, and they've weaponized Christianity. They have demonized Black people in some of their films, educational films and all that. The NRA really has blood on their hands because what they are is a front organization for gun manufacturers. And I try to point this out in my book. They're just a shill organization that whipping up people in the name of God in order to help the gun lobby, the gun manufacturers sell more guns. And gun manufacturers have a huge financial stake in NRA. So you see what I'm saying? It's just a lobbying group for gun manufacturers, which would be problematic enough, except they lobby in the name of God, and they make people think this has something to do with God. That's why this right-wing evangelical movement is so sick and so blasphemous and so anti-Christian. And as I say in the Christians Against Christianity, in that sense, they are imbued with the spirit of Antichrist. And of course, we're not talking about the beast, as in Book of Revelation or Tim LaHaye's fairy tales, Left Behind, or in the Omen, movies like that. First John is the only place that talks about it. The Johannine letter is the only place that talks about Antichrist and Antichrists, plural, and it defines it as in effect, as those who teach something different or opposed to the teaching of Christ in the name of Christ. And that is in the Johannine letters identify that as a spirit of Antichrist. Well, we're fighting a movement that's imbued with the spirit of Antichrist. And no, you don't see that in any greater place than in the NRA and the gun lobby, and this whole notion of we must have more and more guns because God has told us that is our right, and on down the line. So I mean, I hope it's clear what I'm saying here, because it's almost it's so vast a transgression that it's even hard to know where to start. I mean, you're talking about something as crazy as a God-given right to have guns, and we don't care how many children die, how many people commit suicide who wouldn't do it if they couldn't get their hands on a gun, that how many people are killed needlessly on purpose or by mistake. None of that has anything to do with entering into that Christian deliberations at all. It's all about how many guns can be sold and can be bought. That is a blasphemy. That has nothing to do with the gospel, and to try to infuse that with some kind of gospel meaning is just as anti-Christian as you can get. It's anti-Christian. And if I believed in a metaphysical beast, antichrist, I don't, but if I did, this would be one of his weapons.
Wow, that indeed was profound, and I thank you for expanding on that section of your book and your findings. You're right, it is incomprehensible that a faith that is truly a faith that wants to encourage life, a faith that is a faith of peace, would be in any way associated with the death and violence that guns bring to our society, and especially to our children. So I understand better than after having read the book what you mean when you say that the spirit of the Antichrist, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Well, Dr. Hendricks, I cannot thank you enough for your profound scholarship that you have distilled into this wonderful, wonderful book, for your giving us the time that you have this afternoon to engage you. And I applaud you and I thank you. And I pray that everyone in this country will read your book and that we will find a way to come together as true Christians and let the world know what the gospel really is all about, which is helping one another, protecting the vulnerable, and loving one another. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you so much. And I want to commend you for your leadership around these issues.
God bless you and have a wonderful day.
Yes, you too. Bye.